Our previous video looked at how changes in price will influence the amount of a good that is being demanded. But obviously price is not the only thing that will influence the level of demand for a product. So we also need to give some consideration of other factors, and we call these factors the conditions of demand. Now, the easiest way to think about this is to go back to the definition of demand that we've already learned. And demand is the amount or the quantity that consumers are willing and able to buy at a given price. Now, the conditions of demand are the things which will alter that willingness and that ability. So anything which alters people's willingness and or their ability to buy a product at a particular price are considered an alteration of the conditions of demand. So before we actually look at how we actually show this on a diagram, let's think about what sorts of things these might actually be. If we deal with the ability, obviously the main thing that deals with your ability to buy a product is the amount of money that you have. So one of the main conditions of demand is the level of consumer income. So the level of consumer income is affecting, in particular, the ability of consumers to buy the product. What else might influence this? Well, I'm sure you guys have experienced in your life fashions and trends altering people's demand for products. So when a good is in fashion, people are much more willing to buy that particular product. And that is, as we can see there, one of the conditions of demand. So fashions and trends are another factor. They generally alter the willingness to buy this particular product. What else might we be able to consider here? Well, one of the other things, obviously, is just purely the amount of people. If there are more people about, then there are going to be more people that are willing and able to buy the product at any particular price. So the third condition of demand is the population, or sometimes called the market size. And this is having an effect on both the willingness and the ability. So there's a bit of an assumption with some AS pupils that you've got to talk about the size of the national population here. That's not actually true. It's much better to think about it as the market size. So for instance, if there was a new housing development in a town or something like that, then that would be considered to be increasing the population of that town. It doesn't have to be on a national level. Another thing that is going to affect my willingness to buy a product is the price of products which are somehow related to it. Now, I'm going to do a video, and there is indeed a whole topic later on in economics that deals with these more specifically, but the price of related goods will alter my willingness to buy the good that we're talking about. Easy example of this to think about would be, for instance, Coke and Pepsi. So the level of demand for Coke could be changed by changes in price of Pepsi, because I might switch between the two. So as I say, I'm going to go into that in a bit more detail. Don't worry too much about that now. Just remember that the price of related goods is one of the conditions of demand. And the last one is speculation of future price increase. People sometimes get a little bit jumbled up with this one because they see that it's a price increase and they therefore assume that it's a movement along the curve. The key word here is future. So the price hasn't actually changed, it is anticipation, this is expectation. And this one basically works along the lines that if something is if you predict that the value of something is going to rise in the future, then you will be more willing, so again this is a willingness factor, to buy it now. So 5 key conditions of demand. We have to think about the income of the consumers, we have to think about fashions and trends that may be affecting society, we have to think about the size of the market population, we have to think about the price of products which are related to the ones that we're talking about, and we also need to think about speculation of future price changes. So let's have a look at how these things may actually influence the demand curve that we drew on in the last video. So here we go. I've simplified the diagram from the previous video slightly by getting rid of some of the price and quantity values that we had, but I've kept a couple of them. So if you remember, the amount of people that wanted to buy a cup of coffee when it was £1.50 was 4, and the amount of people that wanted to buy a cup of coffee when the price was £1 was 7. On the right there, I have listed all of the things that would create an increase in the level of demand for this cup of coffee. So an increase in income levels. If the pupils in my class had more money, then more of them would presumably be able to buy the product. If I had more pupils in my class, the chances are that more of them would be willing and able to buy the cup of coffee. If the coffee somehow became more desirable, maybe it was first thing in the morning and people needed that caffeine shot to get them going. Maybe there was something in the news the previous day that said that drinking coffee was good for your health, something along those kind of lines. If there was an increase in the price of an alternative, say the price of a cup of tea increased dramatically, or perhaps less likely with a cup of coffee, but if some of my class somehow speculated that the price was going to rise in the future, all of those things would mean that they would be more either willing or able to buy the cup of coffee at any given level of price. So let's think about this in context of the prices that we've actually got there. What that might mean is that when the product was £1.50 before, 4 people were willing to buy it. Now I'm just going to take one of these at a time. So let's just say that I increased the size of the class. So I'm going to be using this factor here. It's probably the easiest one to think about, but all of the others work in the same way. Now, if I increase the amount of pupils in my classroom, then the chances are that there would be more in the classroom willing and able to pay £1.50. So rather than the demand for the product being 4, it may well be the case that that would mean that when the price was £1.50, that actually there were 9 members of the class that were willing to pay the higher price. And similarly, when the price was £1 before, 7 people were willing to buy it, but now that I've added more people to the class, it may well be the case that, let's say, 11 people were now willing to buy my cup of coffee. Now what you can see there is that I've created 2 points kind of outside the demand curve to the right, and if we were to replicate that for all possible levels of price, then what you would find is that actually they would all link up and you would end up with a new demand curve that would be sitting further to the right than the previous demand curve. So this would represent an increase in the level of demand, an increase in demand. The key thing here is that an increase in demand represents a shift of demand to the right. Okay, if we're going to be a little bit more specific, it's from D to D1. So things to remember here that this is a change in the condition of demand, and specifically these are changes in the conditions which will cause an increase in the level of demand, and the result of that increased level of demand is a shift of the demand curve to the right from D to D1. So next slide is just going to be a little bit repetitive. You don't need to go on if you're not sure. The next slide is going to look at those 5 things again and how they might reduce the level of demand. So it might be worth watching just to check that you've got it, but if you feel that you've already grasped that pretty well, then you can probably skip forward a bit. So very quickly then, I'm going to go through the same sort of thing, but I've now manipulated the conditions of demand in such a way that they will now generate a reduction in the level of demand. So I took the population one before. I'm going to take a different one this time just so you can see how it works. So I'm going to take this one here, the good becoming less desirable. So let's say that on the news there was a news article that said drinking too much coffee can increase the chance of you getting cancer. Now, how is that going to influence the good? Well, it's obviously going to make coffee less desirable. What's that going to mean? Well, it means that at every level of price now, my class will be less willing to buy a cup of coffee. So when the price is £1.50, previously 4 people were willing to buy it, but it may well be the case that actually once they have found out about the possible link to cancer, there is only 1 member of my class who really likes coffee, who is still willing to pay £1.50, and when the price is £1, there are now 2 members of my class who are willing to pay £1 for the cup of coffee. So what's happened here is that my demand has shifted to the left. So in this case, my demand has shifted to the left. So in this case, the conditions of demand have meant that there is a reduction in the level of demand for one of the 5 reasons listed below, and the effect of that is that there is a shift to the left, of demand. And again, if we're being specific, from D to D2. So that goes through what the conditions of demand are. Please try to remember that there are 5 conditions of demand. We then talk about those conditions either increasing or reducing the level of demand, and when we increase or reduce the level of demand, we show that by shifting the demand curve to the left and to the right.